So, welcome everybody. My name is Simona Merkinaite. I'm leading the project Rethinking Democratic Future, Lessons from the 20th Century at the Open Lithuania Fund, and it's a project done in partnership with Nowak-Jeziorański College of Eastern Europe and ResPublica Foundation. The overall goal of the project is to rethink the state of democracy through the legacies of revolution in Central and Eastern Europe. I have the honor to moderate today's event, an event that is very much inspired by the link between the past and present, between movements for freedom from 1989 to 2020. In the European Union, we are in a very particular moment in time right now. We are removed from the collapse of the Soviet Empire by merely 30 years, but in increasing numbers of countries, democracies being an object of criticism or outright is dismantled among with some of the civil and key human rights. Yet, along with this slight feeling of disappointment and tiredness from the transition process, we watch the people's uprising from the Euromaidan to the brave men and women today in Belarus, and we're reminded of that extraordinary feeling of change, empowerment, and solidarity, as well as the cost of freedom, which brings us not only to the question of responsibility for our own democracies, but also the responsibility in supporting others in their fight for freedom. What we, people living in democracies, as well as people still struggling for freedom, can learn from the past, as well as the present, and from each other. So it's just a few questions that arise just by virtue of having people, in this case, in virtual room that we have today. So I will not take much more time and I will introduce our speakers. Just a few quick notes before that. You can see this, you will be able to ask the questions. We will have, first of all, 4 speakers who will introduce their initial remarks. And we aim to do that in 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions. So I urge everybody who's watching to just open the chat box on the right of your screen and post the questions, and I will make sure to try and get to as many as possible. So now let me thank all the speakers that found the time to connect today and to speak with us. Let me introduce them. First, we will have Jogilė Ulinskaitė, who is a political scientist from the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. Then we will have Alexeis Grigorievs, the vice chair of the board of the Baltic Black Sea Alliance. He is also a journalist and formerly a member of the Supreme Council of Latvia. Then we will move to Vladimir Yermolenko, who is a Ukrainian philosopher, writer, and journalist. He's also a chief editor at the Ukraine World and a lecturer at Kiev Mohyla Academy. And finally, we will have an input from Maximas Milta, who is the head of Communications and Development Unit at the European Humanities University. For those who's unfamiliar, it is a Belarusian university operating in exile in Lithuania since it was shut down by Lukashenko in 2004. So I suggest I will give the floor now to Jogilė, because I suggest we will start from the historical perspective and then followed by Alexeis. So Jogilė.
Thank you. It's really nice and interesting actually to take part in this debate. So at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, I have a course on contemporary problems of democracy. So we talk a lot about Eastern Europe, Western Europe, United States. And one of the first topics that we cover with students is democratic backsliding. And we look into the data with the students about polarization, liberal democracy index. And from that, you can see that Lithuania is kind of a success story in the region. We do not have at least strong democratic backsliding, that's one thing. We do not experience counter-revolution, the process that you have in Poland and Hungary. So the question that I was trying to answer for this introduction was, are we not there yet? Like, do we need just some time to get there for them to that democratic backsliding, or we just have kind of different situation in Lithuania? So when I was thinking about transition period and how it led to the situation that we have now, one thing was consensus about among the whole political elite regarding the direction where to move forward, like European integration, transatlantic integration was not a question. There was high consensus among the political elite. The other important thing which makes Lithuania kind of different from Western world, at least, that after 1989, the whole Western bloc needed to deal with the empty space that which was dedicated for the enemy. Like many countries before 1989, they had an existential enemy to consolidate their own societies against, and to consolidate political elite against. So I was like, I'm talking about SSSR. And what happened in Lithuania, that after independence was restored, we still had the same enemy. Russia was still the enemy that the whole society could mobilize against. And not only society, political elite as well. And you could see the mobilization, especially when after Russian interference in Georgia and in Ukraine. So the whole mobilization kind of continued. We still had the same enemy. That meant we did not need to find the enemy inside. Hence, polarization is low in Lithuania, both political and social polarization. And the other thing regarding political elite, which could sound kind of controversial, but I was thinking that during transformation period, only small amount of former political elite was restricted from participating in political process moving forward. And at that time, at the beginning of transformation, it had many disadvantages, and it was hard to make huge reforms and quick reforms. And at the same time, that also meant that former communist political elite, they did not have any ground to mobilize together and say that they are restricted from participating in political process. So there was no ground up until now for political polarization, at least among the political elite. So that's my interpretation. But not everything is that kind of pink, or not everything is rainbows. So you still can see nostalgia among society members to those some kind of better times when everything was more secure, more stable. We have to agree that Lithuanian society was really patient during the transition period. At the same time, that meant and led to disappointment and dissatisfaction and low confidence in political institutions. And that is also related to transition period to transformation. And why? Because during the transformation, you can imagine transformation period in different countries in Central Eastern Europe differed, meaning what kind of reforms were implemented, how quickly, which reforms came after which laws you had during the transformation. So my hypothesis is, and I still, we're planning to do research on that, my hypothesis is that during transformation period, it was actually really chaotic time, and there was some norms and laws vacuum, which meant, you can imagine, it was almost a war among the people. What I mean by that, it was not kind of civil war or anything like that, but when you have to transform the whole economy and institutions, when you do not have social norms on how to do that, that means more ambitious or more selfish people can get advantage of that, which led to not only low confidence in political institutions, but also in low social trust, because you, some of the people, I cannot generalize and say that all of them, but some of the people experienced their former colleagues in workplaces or the places that they lived at behaving really selfish and using that vacuum of lack of norms for their own benefit. So that's one of the consequences of quick transformation period, that this trust among society members, we still have that up until today. But I think my final thoughts is that we just had parliamentary election, and from that we can say that liberals and centrist parties, they actually won. That means small anti-establishment political parties, most of populist political parties that could use this satisfaction in the society, they did not win. So I think that's also another sign of that transformation can be implemented well, and that you can avoid counter-revolution in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Jogile. Very interesting. Now I would like to give the floor to Alexei to talk more from the historical perspective from the Baltics.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Jogile, for your presentation. That has been that was very interesting for me, and has led me to some ideas that I would like to touch upon. Some I am, it seems, the oldest of of the participants today. Somebody who can still remember the events of my sister is calling, the events of the transformation in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and I was a very active participant of those. So I would like to say a couple of words on the actual feeling of how it felt to be in the middle of it all. And in the title of today's event, you have hangover. So it presumes that if there is a hangover, there had to have been the state of drunkenness. Well, and indeed, there was a state of euphoria. There was a state that everything is possible, a state of thinking and feeling that everything is possible. All roads are open. We can do everything. And that feeling was really, it was life-giving to the nations, to the people, to all the participants that united. They like to unite in big demonstrations, and I'll switch that off. And talk to each other, and okay, I'll switch off. So that feeling was there. It was that feeling, I think, was predicated on the fighting for freedom. So it was freedom that united us. And Adam Michnik writes in one of his books that after freedom was conquered, so the next fighting for power started, and that is the next and a lot less pleasant stage that started almost immediately. I can even remember the day when I felt that, okay, we are all united, we are all fighting for freedom and independence, and the next day I see those are groups organizing parties, sort of organizing clubs now, and who is getting where, who will be the who will be this minister, who will be that. It really was like the turn of the switch. But all of that was natural because sort of the democracy works through parties. People have to have in group interests. That's absolutely normal, but still it felt as a step back, as something on the way to this hangover, and on the way from liberal euphoria to the sort of the everyday running of the country, which could be bureaucratic, boring, had to do with lots of compromises, not all of them pleasant, and so there was that feeling, and part of that I think was natural. So this. So in that sense, the answer to your question that that every revolution ends in a hangover is correct, partly, only partly, especially for those revolutions that win. I would like to see this process, and I think that's a correct way, in the framework of disintegration of an empire. And if you look at it from this perspective, you can see that it hasn't ended, and that it is continuing. In that sense, it's continuing in two ways. Some nations are still fighting for their independence, for their freedom. And also you can see the resistance to that movement, to that fight, and attempts at restoring, reintegration of the territories into the empire in one disguise or another. That is the process we are seeing. And into this, the war in Georgia, into this paradigm, the war in Georgia, Russia's war against Georgia, the war in Ukraine, Russia's occupation of the Crimea and areas of eastern Ukraine, the continued Russian occupation of Transnistria, territory of the Republic of Moldova, and even war in Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, fall nicely into that paradigm. In that sense, we have made, the Baltic countries have made great strides towards making their independence and freedom permanent. And I think that is more or less the strategic objective of these countries and these nations. They and the movement towards European Union, the movement into NATO, the movement into other international organizations, the building of Baltic prestige into these organizations, building alliances within these organizations. All this is leading to the strategic goal. I am satisfied that our countries and our nations see that we are not alone, and that if we are helping others that are still some steps back on the same road, and that they need our assistance. And I'm talking about Georgia at the time when Russia attacked it, and Ukraine nowadays, Belarus exactly these days. That we understand them much better than France or England or Germany do, because we have been there, we have the same experience. Remember the days of the Maidan, in Ukraine. People who had no Ukrainian no Ukrainian roots, no Ukrainian contacts very often, they still immediately understood what the whole thing is about, and they felt for it. They were, living with it, with the events in Kiev, and living through these events as if these were our children, our brothers and sisters who were fighting and who were falling, who were killed in these events, because this is something that we have seen on January the 13th in Vilnius, on January the 20th, 1991 in Latvia, in Riga, and so this was something that is very, very close to us. I think I'm through my time. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody that people can post questions as they go through the discussion, and well, if any of the other speakers want to make any short remark, then we also can do those. And then in that, I suggest we move further in time towards today, and I would like to invite Vladimir now to reflect on Euromaidan, an event that occupies quite a lot of space in contemporary political imagination. And if some of you may have seen a recently published report by Arena at the London School of Economics, From Memory Wars to Common Future, which reaffirms that Euromaidan indeed is quite still a polarizing issue. So Vladimir, I invite you to now unmute and make your remarks.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for inviting. It's a great pleasure to be in such a good company. It's a great pleasure to talk in terms of region, the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe, not only in terms of a particular country. I think this is something we need to try much more often. I was also happy to participate in this Arena project of London School of Economics, so I know you're talking about quite well. Let me first start with the agreement with what Alex said. I think this is a perfect a formula of what, for example, Lithuanians or Latvians were feeling about Euromaidan, and what Ukrainians are now feeling about Belarus protests. I think many Ukrainians really have this sympathy to Belarus protests, and seeing what is happening in Minsk and other Belarusian cities as a kind of very familiar experience, and therefore something that emotionally binds us very much. So we are at the beginning of the Belarusian protests. Ukrainian intelligentsia, myself including, we made a statement in which I remember the first words that we were following these events with the great empathy and sympathy, but also with the great anxiety, because we know that everything around these events, around these protests is very dangerous for people, specific people, and it is very often linked to violence. And of course, this is also another part of this. Let me just briefly say 5 points with relation to revolutions and to our region, Ukraine, Belarus, and the wider Eastern and Central Europe. The first point is this. I would say that the events in Ukraine, Belarus, earlier Georgia, show that we cannot talk about the value of walls. We cannot talk about axiological walls. Remember that famous essay of Milan Kundera of early 80s, when he talked about the kidnapped West, saying that Central Europe is essentially Western land, which was kidnapped by the Eastern monster USSR. But I think the next events show that you cannot really draw the line between West and East in that sense, because the values are moving farther to the east. So they move to Baltics, then they move to Belarus, and it's a big question for me, because the question is whether these values of individual freedom, dignity will also spread to Russia, and whether the contemporary Russia would always also have such revolutions as in Ukraine, Belarus. And that's a big question. I think we need to ask that. I personally believe that it is quite possible. In the events in Khabarovsk, or the new generation of Russians which is emerging, show that it is quite possible, right? The second point is that despite this commonality between our countries, I see big differences also, which we also need not to neglect. Because there is always like a comparison between Ukraine and Poland, or Ukraine and Czech Republic, or Ukraine and the Baltic states, with the statement, so why these countries succeeded much more in the reforms in the 90s, and Ukraine, for example, did not succeed in that? Well, the answer is that it's not because Ukrainians are bad and Poles are good. It's because the geopolitical situation was different. The West, the Western countries, the Western economy came into the countries of the socialist bloc, and basically played a very important role in the transformation from the authoritarian planning economy to the market economy. And the second issue, of course, there was this security umbrella, which was gradually evolving in the late 90s and finally ended up in the membership in the EU and NATO of these countries. Whereas Ukraine and Belarus are different parts of the story, why the Soviet Union, and it continues to exist in the 90s, in the years 2000, in a different form, when Moscow was still controlling very much in terms of security, economy, etc. And when the economy was privatized, taken over not so much by global enterprises, but by the party nomenclatura and criminal circles, like in Ukraine, or just by the party nomenclatura as in Belarus. This was the origin of what we call, for example, the Ukrainian oligarchic system, and that was the origin of the current Belarusian regime. We've seen current Belarusian regime collapsing right now, and we've seen the different stages of crisis of Ukrainian oligarchic economy, but it still survives many revolutions. So in a way, the opposition to reforms is much harder. Therefore, the Ukrainian transition process is so slow, and I wonder whether the Belarusian transition process would not also be that slow, because the internal opposition is much stronger. I would say that, for example, in late 80s in Poland, Czechoslovakia, maybe Baltic countries. So this comes to my third point. I would not talk about the hangovers after revolution. I would say that the key word is evolution, and revolutions are just the steps in this bigger historical process. So the bigger historical process is there. We see, despite the crisis of liberal democracy in the Western world, we see the renaissance of the liberal democracy in the Eastern Europe, in the countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and maybe one day Russia, and then Georgia and Caucasus and Armenia, etc. And this is a very interesting process, which invites us to think about it in terms of very slow evolution, which should turn decades. Like how you, for example, change a judiciary system of post-Soviet space. You cannot change it in 3 years. You need decades. And this is something, I think this is a kind of patience we all need to have, but at the same time to understand that it is huge opposition from within and from the outside. The outside, I mean the Russian Empire, which Alex mentioned, but there is a huge opposition also from within, from these oligarchic circles, for example. The fourth point is very important for me. I would say that we are living in the epoch of a crisis or collapse of a liberal conservative consensus, which was in the Western world and although also in Eastern Europe from 80s to 90s, I think until the 9/11. So 9/11 started this trigger, this starting point of division between liberal discourse and conservative discourse. And we see right now these major splits in the United States, in Britain, in Poland, in Hungary, along these lines. So the major split between liberals and conservatives, while they were like ruling the discourse throughout the 80s and 90s. And I think this is a very dangerous phenomenon because it is radicalizing both parts, both liberals and conservatives. In a way, these revolutions like Euromaidan, or maybe even contemporary Belarusian revolution is a kind of it's always a synthesis between liberal values and patriotic values, because as my previous colleagues have said, there is always this external enemy against which you are mobilizing. Maybe in Belarus it's not that visible, but I think it will going to be more and more visible. And the way that this liberal conservative consensus is kind of driving these revolutions, when it collapses, and Ukraine also shows the signs of its crisis of this consensus, you lose ground for this kind of opposition to this neo-imperialist threat. The last point will be about Russia, is that Russia is not only about the external military threat. Russia is also about the hybrid warfare. Russia is also about this, proxy forces, agents, proxy media. Ukrainian example shows that this is a very key thing that is going on, because pro-Russian forces, for example, own big TV channels, and they, to some extent, they can form part of the discourse. So I would say that in today's world, we are living in a situation when we no longer know that, for example, we are no longer Fukuyamist of the late 80s or early 90s, when we are sure that liberal democracy will win. And that's a big message we should internalize, I think. The liberal democracy is no longer a clear winner in the ideological battle. Therefore, the situation is much more alarming than before. But again, let me come back to my first point. Despite this crisis of liberal democracy throughout the world, it's interesting how Eastern Europe, which was always kind of a historically place for rather authoritarian values, are rediscovering these liberal values again. But they both these societies, like all these societies, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, need to prepare for a very long and patient period of transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. It was very interesting. And so we right on time arrived to the present day world. And I would like to now give the floor to Maximas, who will speak not only from his academic, but as well as his personal perspective. He's now safely back in Vilnius, but he was in Minsk right when the protests broke out and spent almost 2 months there, providing also very informative daily updates to the world on what was happening. And while at this time, Belarus is still in the middle of the protest movement, and we cannot know what the future holds, but I think at this point it's quite safe to say that the things will hardly ever go back to where they were. So I would like to ask Maxim now to provide his insights.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you for having me today. Indeed, I can only, in one way, reflect on what's been happening in the context of Belarus in the course of the last 72 days, because 72 days are actually the amount of days that the protest is still lasting in Lithuania's closest neighborhood, and also in the closest neighborhood both of Ukraine and also of Latvia. So whenever the national perspectives that we've been discussing today, they are also quite directly interrelated with the neighborhoods that our three countries are sharing with. So therefore, it seems to me that this emotional bond between nations that has been mentioned both by Alex and by Volodymyr, this is indeed something very meaningful, something quite important, and it goes far beyond just sharing one another historical, period of mutual history, but this horizontal context between people that are alive, that are thriving. And clearly, especially here in Lithuania, but also this counts for Ukraine, and I'm quite confident that for Latvia as well, that for people this is quite easy to reflect through and to live through the Belarusian experience, not because of the early experience of late 80s, early 90s, but also about particularly the existence of these horizontal bonds between people. At the same time, whenever we are eager to do this comparativist analysis, it seems to me that we are somehow limited in terms of the insight and in terms of how fruitful this debate can bring us. Before the revolt has broke out in Belarus, and I use the term revolt here on purpose. It seems to me that revolt is something that fits more to describe the state of developments currently in Belarus rather than revolution. There was a quite popular opinion that, it may be that Armenia, for instance, is somewhat a role model for Belarus, where Mr. Pashinyan and his arrival to office may be somewhat a path that could outbreak in Belarus. But what we are quite confident to claim that it's Belarus definitely is not Armenia, and it's not Moldova, and it's not Ukraine or Georgia, because the developments that we are observing in Belarus, they clearly are much closer to the movement of Solidarność in Poland, of Sąjūdis in Lithuania, of the National Front in Latvia. This is something of an overwhelming character that is fostered by the horizontal bonds between people, which is not concentrated in a particular geography or particular demography or social group, but at the same time that is a quite decentralized movement. Within Sąjūdis, within Solidarność epoch, from what I understand, although I have not been lucky to experience that, I'm too young for that, but nevertheless, from what I understood from the academic papers, is that in certain moments, it was not just a single decision-making center for the movements, and this is something what we can characterize about Belarus quite evidently. Now, before preparing for today's discussion, I was eager to bring in the perspective of civic engagement, the civic engagement of people, in particular of students, and also the academic dimension of protests, because it seems to me that it can bring quite fruitful analysis whenever we discuss this post-revolutionary hangover, right, and this emotional state of affairs in Belarus. They say that there is this rule of 21/90. So it takes you 21 days to, let's say, develop a habit, and then 90 days to make it a daily routine. So if we have a look on what has been the day 21 of Belarusian protests, it was actually the day when it was already in the third time in a row the women's rallies were taking place. It was the same day when already 17 journalists representing the largest and most respected international media outlets were revoked of their accreditations. This has been also quite close to the day when students and faculty and also teachers of high schools, they have formed quite a quite tangible social group in their demand against the regime, because these were actually the days when Mr. Lukashenko has claimed that since Belarus has a state ideology and has a state-driven education, then those who are not eager to follow the ideologies, they should be, basically the regime should end with them, and there is no room for them in the education system of Belarus. And basically August 24th, August 25th were the days when students, faculty, and teachers have demonstrated quite evidently as a very important, very tangible, quite verifiable force of this overwhelming movement that we see in Belarus, the movement of the revolt. And if we try to split chronologically the emotional setback of this movement, I would say that there are three phases. There is the phase of obviously these bloodiest days and nights in Belarus. In the case of Belarus, this has been evidently August 9th till August 12th, when the emotional state of despair, the emotional state of a feeling that hardly there is any sustainable room to continue the fight for freedom and dignity, whenever you have over 2,000 and 3,000 people being detained during a single night. This has been the common factor, the common emotional state of the nation. But then the intermediate position has come into place, and this intermediate position, emerging roughly around August 13th, has been lasting for quite a while, for over a month, in my assumption of staying in Minsk, at least in those days. This intermediate position has brought in more visibility of the diverse range of social groups. And once again, I want to emphasize this academic dimension in broader perspective: the students, faculty, and teachers, and their contribution to the protest. And this intermediate position has brought in quite vivid example of this emotional roller coaster, that this emotional swing that currently Belarusians are experiencing, this emotional roller coaster which emerges on the Sunday rally, which has become a tradition. Yesterday it was already the 10th Sunday rally in a row taking place in Minsk and other major cities of Belarus. But at the same time, from the moment of utmost euphoria, and this is what Alex was bringing us, the euphoria of revolt, it's also cracked down quite rapidly by the use of force, of brutal force of the regime. And we see that the regime is not limited exclusively only by water cannons, by rubber bullets, by tear gas, but also by the brutality, how broadly this offense is used against all social groups of the society, no matter the age or gender or social position, because this brutality of aggression is used against pensioners, against disabled people, against minors. And therefore, inevitably, the swing is somewhere in between the euphoria of these largest rallies and the crackdowns that are following on a daily basis. But now this is the term 3 that I would say. This is the phase 3 of the long-term swing. So this is not a roller coaster, the emotional roller coaster for daily basis, but this is rather a swing that's been lasting and it continues to last these days. Because what is essentially here is this decentralized character of the movement, which is an overwhelming mobilization of all groups of the society. I did my best while staying in Minsk for 52 days. I tried to find a single person who was voting in favor of this cruel regime, and I failed. I tried talking to taxi drivers, I tried talking to pensioners, I tried talking to people working in the industries, and I did fail. And this is a very clear evidence that the social contract that has been, let's say, one of the most vivid features of this regime has evaporated. There is simply no more room for this social contract to preserve the early existing status quo, and especially whenever the news has come in about the victims, about the sufferings, and about the cruelty that over 14,500 Belarusians have experienced while being detained. Over 300 people remain under criminal persecution. There are 92 political prisoners currently in Belarus. So in this state of affairs, on one side, the emotional setback is something of inevitable character. And many Belarusians, in fact, what they say and what they are frankly sharing on social media, because we should also not ignore the technological side of the protest. The technological advancement has been quite important in terms of the fostering the protest to carry on. It's been said that several YouTube vloggers are somewhat becoming psychotherapists of entire Belarus, and there is this Russian-speaking YouTube vlogger called Max Katz, and on a daily basis, when he releases his new YouTube videos, for many Belarusians who I've heard, this is somewhat a form of collective psychotherapy that they're experiencing almost on a daily basis. And this is an important feature, that there is no more fear, that fear has been overcome, but at the same time, people are eager to realize and recognize this emotional roller coaster that they're experiencing, but at the same time, the mobilization against the highly personalized regime of Alexander Lukashenko is there, and the stamina, the persistence that people are demonstrating, it shall evaporate, because there is simply no room for the return to the status quo that existed before August the 9th. And the very example of what's been happening in Minsk just 1.5 hours ago, the fact that for the third week in a row, pensioners has gone out again on a Monday rally, which has become a tradition for pensioners in Belarus. It demonstrates again that there is simply no more social group left which would be somehow ignorant of the brutality of the regime, and this remains only a question of time. And therefore, the bonds that our nations do share in regards to Belarus that are essential here, because thanks to these bonds, thanks to solidarity, the support that can be provided to Belarus should and must be provided if we, all of us, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, are eager to ensure the sustainable development of our closest neighbor, right? Because if we come up together the kilometers of the borders that we share with Belarus, I assume we would come up with 1,500 kilometers of the border that our three nations share with Belarus. And this is an important security factor as well for all of the three countries. Therefore, it is impossible to at this moment to declare what will be the final momentum, what will be the D-Day. As you know, there has been this national ultimatum announced recently, and the deadline is October 25th. It is expected that if the regime fails to fulfill the ultimatum to release the political prisoners and to initiate a real, genuine dialogue and route free and transparent elections, October 26 will be the start of the nationwide strikes. We're looking forward to see that happening, because the capacity and the potential of Belarusian nation has been quite clear. It is very powerful. It is full of stamina, persistence, no matter the brutality of the regime when it's trying to use the very last attempts to ensure its place in the office. Thank you, Simona, for giving me the room to share this insight, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Maxim. We have around 12 minutes. First of all, I want to ask any of the participants, do any of you want to make any remark in reaction to anything that was said, or should we proceed with the questions?
Can I? I have a question to Maxim. It's really, well, exciting to hear everything that you're saying and all those personal stories, emotional stories, and those roller coasters. This summer I had a conversation. I was part of one discussion with one of important members of Sąjūdis, and it was really interesting to hear how he was explaining Sąjūdis in terms of strategic change management. So he's saying that Sąjūdis, at least main organizers, they were trying to do two things at the same time. So one thing was fear management. So that's similar to what you were saying. So fear management and also creating trust from the society towards sąjūdis, that they would be able to implement change, like sustainable change. So yeah, they were providing organizers, main organizers, key organizers of sąjūdis, they were providing arguments to the society why they should oppose the regime, and also building kind of trust with them that they will be able to implement change. So I was wondering if that kind of strategic change management is taking place in Belarus.
This is something very important that you stress, especially the management of the fear, because the aspect of fear has been one of the bases, one of the instruments how Lukashenko's regime has been building up itself, this all power vertical in the course of the last 26 years. But at the same time, the essential difference of the revolt in Belarus is that essentially there is no Professor Landsbergis in Belarus, right? There is no single personality that you can identify the movement with. On one hand, Belarusians do agree with the fact that they have voted in favor of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya on August the 9th, but at the same time, the movement in Belarus is genuinely a grassroots movement. And this is where the utmost potential of the movement lies in. It is the horizontal bonds between individual people in both in Minsk and all over the country that actually makes this second dimension of sąjūdis that you mentioned, this enlightenment work, sort of, right? This persuasion and argumentation. And the most vivid example of this aspect of the movement is what we see with the so-called local chat groups. Now, the technological side of the protest is something I'm quite confident that will be discussed in a number of political sciences related papers in the future. But there is this app called Telegram that has been very instrumental in Belarus, which is quite popular to be used in the countries where internet limitations are imposed, in the countries like Iran, for instance, and Belarus as well. And you know that every Sunday, mobile internet is simply switched off in Belarus, and also there was these 72 hours without internet access at all around the entire country from August 9th till August 12th. So these local chat groups, the local groups that are formed in every neighborhoods of Minsk and all other places across the country. In Minsk alone, there are more than 800 local chat groups that are GPS attached, so they're geographically attached to one another neighborhoods all across the city. And through these local groups, this is where the activism happens. This is where these horizontal bonds are established between people. And for the first time in their lives, people are actually meeting their neighbors. They are recognizing this feeling of the community, of the grassroots movement. And therefore, this is what is enormously important in the way how mobilization is formed. So there is no commander-in-chief that orders to go en route, to march en route a House of Parliament, but instead, this is exactly this grassroots-driven, horizontal-driven mobilization that I believe is the source of the Enlightenment activism when we talk about finding arguments against the regime.
Thank you so much. I think that while we're doing this project, again and again arises the question of how the revolutions are shifting in terms of going from the end of 20th century to 21st. And one of the issues that come up is that leadership, intellectual leadership of the revolution that we had to have back in 30 years ago. And today, the whole protest movement is changing due to the organization coming from grassroots, where everybody can organize. But in the end, it's like neighbors had to trust neighbors, so they would get into the Baltic Way originally 30 years ago, and now everybody go in the streets and in Ukraine and now in Belarus, and you still meet your own neighbors. So there's maybe that commonality. Towards the end, I have a question from a very pragmatic listener of ours. This question goes both to Maxim and to Vladimir. The question is how much the protest in Belarus and revolution in Ukraine just a matter of falling living standards. Had the standards remained acceptable, the societies would have tolerated the regimes. Maybe that's the question. Who wants to go first?
Volodymyr, would you prefer to go first?
Okay, Maximas. I think I'm not sure this is the correct description of what's going on. I'm sure Maximas will tell you more about Belarus, but the first years of Yanukovych from 2010, 2012, 13 were not the worst ones for Ukrainians in terms of living standards. The same can be said about 2004, 2005, when Ukraine had the Orange Revolution, when the elections were frauded. Take another example. Ukrainian living standards really fell down after the war with Russia, after occupation of Crimea, after the war in Donbass. In 2015, Ukrainian GDP fell by 15%. We lost immediate trade with Russia because Russia started a trade war against Ukraine. And against this background, there was there were no Maidan. So people were unhappy about their government. People were blaming the government of Poroshenko. Some people, for example, and therefore Poroshenko lost his election. Whether people were right or were wrong, that's another question. But there was this ability to have the free election and then not to vote for Poroshenko. That's what happened. I think when there are falling standards, but there is still democracy, you can go and vote, and there are some other this feeling of empowerment of people. For example, right now, next Sunday we will have local elections in Ukraine, and in the process of decentralization, they become very, very important, probably the most important local election in Ukrainian history. So Ukrainians can have another tool to say, well, this is my vote, I can do something about it, and I still have a choice. This feeling of empowerment, it kind of continued after Euromaidan. So even people who voted against Poroshenko and for Zelensky, and maybe sometimes skeptical about Maidan, but they had this feeling of empowerment. I think this is more important in the question of people going to the streets than living standards. But there is another point of it, and I think these post-revolutionary societies in Belarus and Ukraine will need to face this challenge, is that in Ukraine, there were no social agenda, post-Maidan social and economic agenda politicians to put forward, because the narrative which were leading Maidan was basically, as I said, liberal patriotic narrative. It was not a social narrative. It was not a narrative of redistribution. It was vaguely a narrative against the oligarchs, but nobody really is suggesting something, a viable tool how to ensure the more equal in terms of economy and social life, more equal society. And this is a big crisis because the ideas are coming from the West, for example, liberal ideas, the democratic ideas, but for example, the reforms agenda, what Ukraine has been doing since 2014 are mostly the liberal economic agenda. And it is good because it is able to make the economics running. But the problem is that it is not solving the issues of social and economic inequality, which are, Ukraine is part of the global world, and these issues are growing everywhere. Everywhere we see the growing inequalities. So it's another issue that the big question, whether these liberal revolutions really lead to the improvement of social standards and improvement of economic life of citizens? That's a big question we need to ask as well. Thanks.
Well, talking about the economic dimension of the revolt, on one end, it's impossible to ignore the downturn of the Belarusian economy in the course of the last decade. It's been quite picturesque, and it's one of the best illustrations of the bankruptcy of the Lukashenko regime, that in the course of the last 10 years, the average salary in Belarus has not been growing, despite the rapid increase of the share of economy which has been contributed by the IT sector, which evidently has much larger salaries that are paid to the people involved in that area. And in Minsk alone, there is an estimate of up to 100,000 people who were directly economically dependent on the IT sector. So clearly, we see in this instance that the economic model of Lukashenko, wherever no structural reforms were conducted, it has basically brought Belarus to a state of affairs where in 2020, the average salary in the country currently is around 390 euros per month. But the economic dimension is not the only one, obviously, that has been a trigger of the protest. The trigger, however, is often labeled as the ignorance of Lukashenko regime against the COVID pandemic. The ignorance that has been demonstrated, which basically has imposed a direct threat to the health and safety of Belarusians, has demonstrated to them that it is only unless Belarusians themselves are capable to mobilize, are capable to put their resources together through various crowdfunding and crowdsourcing initiatives, they would be able to protect their safety, to protect their health. And this has been a very important, very tangible step en route the further revolt that has emerged after August the 9th. So therefore, the social dimension of the revolt, I can definitely agree with Volodymyr. This is the absence of the direct social agenda within the revolt is something what in this instance Belarus and Ukraine are sharing. If we compare the developments in Belarus of right now and the Maidan of 2013-2014, but at the same time, it has been not the economic situation itself that has triggered the protest. Instead, the direct threat that has been imposed against Belarusians have demonstrated to them that this regime has basically bankrupted in terms of securing the safety and the health of the people living in the country.
Thank you. So we are past 1 hour. If everybody is up to, I can ask one last question that we have in the chat box for Vladimir. Very as efficiently as you can. Okay, Vladimir. The question is, how important is the success of anti-corruption reform in avoiding a post-revolutionary hangover in Ukraine? Briefly.
Briefly, it is important, but to make it like probably a little bit in more detail, I would say that not only the anti-corruption reform, I mean, the whole thing, we're now making focus groups across, by the way, by LSE that you mentioned initially, across Ukraine. We understand that it is not a particular reform which matters for people. It's the whole space, it's a pace, it's the whole understanding whether it's moving somewhere. And when people elected Zelensky last year, it was not a hangover against Maidan, because Zelensky has the same political agenda, basically, going to Europe, integration with the West, etc. So it's not that issue that matters. I think that space of reforms which people found not really convincing for them, and people found some of the reforms as bad for their personal lives, for their personal household. So this is a much more complex issue than simply anti-corruption.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank everybody for participating. I would suggest if anyone has the last comments, you can go for it. Other than that, I want to thank everybody. It was a very interesting conversation, and I think it's safe to say that with all that is happening in Belarus, this kind of international perspective and interest in what's happened, it will only just continue. And I hope that we will have the chance to continue this conversation as well. I see everybody's already tired. So thank you very much. And